The first hawk she ever watched through her father's borrowed field glasses had taught her that the sky belonged to no one. And that lesson was what carried Mabel Graves 2,000 miles west on a rattling Union Pacific car, and then a jolting stagecoach, until she stepped down into the dust of Elk Fork, Colorado territory, in the spring of 1875, with a satchel of notebooks, a case of pressed feathers, and not one single person in the world who had wanted her to come. The town was smaller than she had imagined from the railroad pamphlets. A single dirt street lined with a mercantile, a livery, a squat log church, and a hotel whose sign read the Elk Fork House in paint, so faded it looked more like a suggestion than a name. Behind it all rose the mountains, blue-gray and enormous, their upper slopes still streaked with the last snow of winter, and Mabel stood in the road with her skirts gathering dust and simply stared at them the way another woman might have stared at a cathedral. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and had been informed by the Boston Ornithological Society, in a letter she still carried folded in her breast pocket, that no woman had ever been granted a field commission to study the alpine bird populations of the Rocky Mountains, and that she would be granted one now only on the condition that she return within 4 months with a complete accounting of nesting sites for the white-tailed ptarmigan, the golden eagle, and any other species she judged worthy of record. It was, she understood, a test designed for her to fail. She intended to pass it so thoroughly that no one would ever again write such a letter to any woman. The innkeeper's wife, a broad, kind-faced woman named Mrs. Hutchins, took one look at Mabel's trunk of scientific instruments and her city-cut traveling dress and shook her head slowly, as if she were watching a lamb walk toward a wolf's den of its own accord. "You mean to go up into those mountains alone, Miss Graves?" "I mean to go up into those mountains with a guide, Mrs. Hutchins, if I can find one willing to be hired and sensible enough not to laugh at me." "Well, you won't find many of either in this town. Most of the men here are cattle and mining men. They don't know a nest from a rock pile, and they wouldn't care to learn." Mrs. Hutchins wiped her hands on her apron and considered. "There's one man might do it. Owen Mercer. Lives up past Silvertip Peak, trapped and hunted these hills longer than any man alive, knows every deer trail and every creek crossing for 30 miles, keeps to himself mostly. Comes down maybe once a month for supplies and speaks about as much as a fence post." "Is he trustworthy?" Mrs. Hutchins's face softened in a way that told Mabel there was a story there, one that would not be offered freely. "He's the most trustworthy man in this territory, Miss Graves. Whether he'll agree to take you up that mountain is another matter entirely. He doesn't care much for strangers, especially not strangers who talk about birds instead of gold." Mabel had crossed a continent for this. She was not about to be deterred by a silent man in the woods. Owen Mercer came down from the mountain 3 days later, and Mabel knew him before anyone told her his name, because he did not walk into town so much as arrive in it, the way weather arrives, drawing the eye of every person on the street. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders in a way that his buckskin coat could not disguise, with forearms roped in muscle from years of hauling traps and felling timber, and hauling his own life up mountainsides that would have broken lesser men. His hair was dark and too long for town fashion, tied back with a leather cord, and a beard shadowed a jaw that looked as though it had been carved rather than grown. He led a pack mule loaded with pelts, and he moved through the street with the unhurried economy of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry for anyone. Mabel found herself standing in his path outside the mercantile before she had entirely decided to do so. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "my name is Mabel Graves. I am told you are the only man in Elk Fork who might guide me safely into the high country." He looked at her the way a man looks at a strange bird that has landed on his porch rail, without hostility but without any particular welcome either. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, like creek water running over stone. "I don't guide," he said, and made to step past her. "I am a naturalist," Mabel said quickly, before he could pass. I have come from Boston to study the nesting habits of the birds of these mountains. I have a commission from a scientific society, and I have money to pay a fair wage for a guide's time. I do not need company for conversation, Mr. Mercer. I need someone who knows this mountain well enough to keep me from falling off it while I do my work." Something flickered in his expression, gone before she could name it. Boston. Yes. Long way to come for birds. They are not merely birds to me, Mr. Mercer. They are my life's work. She heard the edge of desperation creeping into her own voice and hated it, but pressed on. I have 4 months to produce a record that will prove a woman is capable of serious scientific labor. If I fail, I do not simply fail myself. I fail every woman who might have come after me. I am asking for your help. I am not asking for your approval of the reason." For a long moment he said nothing at all, only studied her with those pale eyes as though weighing the truth of her in silence the way another man might weigh a coin. Then he glanced up briefly at the mountain behind the town, its peak catching the last gold light of afternoon, and something in his face changed, some old private thought crossing it and passing on. "There's a golden eagle nest above Cataract Creek," he said finally. "Been there longer than I have. You'd have to leave before first light to reach it and be back down before dark. Then I shall be ready before first light, Mr. Mercer." "Owen," he said. "If we're going to be climbing rock together, you might as well use my name." "Owen," she repeated, and something about the way she said it made him look at her again, just a fraction longer than was strictly necessary. They left Elk Fork before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, Mabel dressed in a plain wool riding skirt she had specially sewn for the purpose, her field glasses around her neck, a canvas satchel of notebooks and specimen jars slung over one shoulder. Owen had provided her a sturdy mountain pony, and he walked ahead of her leading his own horse, moving up the game trail with a silent, unhurried certainty that made the climbing look effortless, though Mabel's lungs burned in the thin air within the first mile. "You're breathing wrong," he said without turning around, the first words he had spoken since they left town. "I beg your pardon. You're gulping air like a fish on a dock. Breathe slower, deeper. The mountain doesn't reward folks who fight it. It rewards folks who go along with it." She adjusted her breathing, resentfully at first, and found within a quarter mile that he was right, that the burning in her chest eased when she stopped trying to conquer the incline and instead simply moved through it. She said nothing about this small victory, but she noticed, from the set of his shoulders ahead of her, that he had noticed her silence and seemed satisfied by it. They climbed for 2 hours, through stands of lodgepole pine and across a talus slope where marmots whistled alarm calls at their passing, before Owen held up one broad hand and stopped. "Quiet now," he murmured. "We're close." He led her the last stretch on foot, tying the horses to a stunted juniper, and brought her to the lip of a granite outcropping that looked down over a plunging gorge where Cataract Creek roared white over black rock far below. On the far wall of the gorge, tucked into a shelf of stone that seemed to Mabel entirely inaccessible to anything without wings, sat an enormous nest of sticks and grass, easily 6 feet across, built up over what must have been decades of use. "Golden eagles," Owen said quietly, crouching beside her. "Same pairs used that nest every spring for 11 years that I know of, maybe longer. I found it when I was a younger man trapping this creek for beaver." Mabel lifted her field glasses with trembling hands, and there, wheeling on a thermal above the gorge, was the female, her wings spanning what Mabel judged to be nearly 7 feet, gold-brown feathers catching the morning light like poured bronze. "Oh," Mabel breathed, and it was not a scientific word, not a word from any of her careful notebooks, but the only word that came. "Oh, she is magnificent." Owen watched her rather than the bird for a moment, something unguarded crossing his weathered face, before he too turned his eyes to the sky. "She's fierce too. Watched her drive off a cougar once that got too curious about her chicks. Didn't even seem afraid, just angry." "How did you find this place, so hidden as it is?" "Same way I find everything up here." He gestured at the mountain around them, the peaks stacked one behind another into blue distance. I've walked every foot of this range for 15 years. There's not a creek I haven't followed to its source, not a ridge I haven't stood on. This mountain doesn't give up her secrets easy, Miss Graves, but she gives them up if you're patient and if you respect her." Mabel lowered her glasses and looked at him properly for the first time, not as an obstacle to her work but as a man, and found herself curious about him in a way she had not expected to be. "You speak of the mountain as though she were a person. Maybe she is, in her way, older than any person and wiser, and she doesn't suffer fools. I've seen men die up here for not listening to her, and I've seen her keep things safe that the whole world below forgot existed." He looked at her sideways. "Like that eagle's nest. Nobody in Elk Fork even knows it's here. I never told a soul until you. Why tell me?" He considered the question longer than she expected, as if it deserved more honesty than a quick answer could provide. "Because you looked at that bird like she mattered. Most folks that come up this mountain are looking for gold or pelts or something to kill. You're the first one in a long while looking for something to save." Mabel felt an unexpected warmth rise in her chest at that, and busied herself with her notebook so he would not see her cheeks color, sketching quickly the outline of the nest, the wingspan of the circling eagle, the rough coordinates of the gorge as best she could determine them from the sun's position. They spent the whole of that first day at the gorge, and Owen, though he had warned her of his silence, proved willing enough to talk when the subject turned to the mountain itself. He knew, it seemed, an entire hidden world that the town below had no notion of, a wallet where elk gathered each September to spar for mates, a hot spring tucked in a fold of rock that steamed even in the coldest months, a stand of ancient bristlecone pine that he said might be older than the nation itself. Mabel found herself filling pages not only with observations of birds but with fragments of his knowledge, unable to stop herself, because it was, she realized, its own kind of poetry, spoken by a man who did not seem to know he was a poet. They returned to Elk Fork well after dark, both of them saddle-sore and weary, and Mrs. Hutchins met them at the door of the inn with a lantern and an expression of some relief. "I was beginning to worry," she said. "Did you find your birds, Miss Graves?" "I found more than I could have hoped for," Mabel said, and glanced at Owen, who was already turning to lead the horses to the livery, his broad back lit gold by the lantern light. "Mr. Mercer is a rather extraordinary guide." Mrs. Hutchins's eyebrows rose, but she said only, "Is he now?" in a tone that suggested she had drawn a conclusion Mabel was not yet ready to examine. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that Mabel would later remember as among the happiest of her life, though she would not have named it so at the time, being far too occupied with the discipline of her work to notice what else was happening to her heart. Each morning before dawn, she met Owen at the edge of town, and together they rode up into some new fold of the mountain, seeking out nests he knew of or ones they discovered together. A pair of dippers nesting in the spray of a waterfall, their small gray bodies bobbing on wet stones. A colony of white-tailed ptarmigan camouflaged so perfectly against the alpine scree that Mabel walked past 3 of them before Owen touched her arm and pointed with a small, private smile. Mountain bluebirds nesting in the hollow of a lightning-scarred aspen, the male's plumage so vivid a blue against the white bark that Mabel gasped aloud the first time she saw one. Owen never tired of her questions, though he answered most of them briefly, in a low voice roughened by disuse, as though he had spent so many years talking only to himself, or to his animals that ordinary conversation had become a kind of relearned language. But Mabel noticed that the longer they spent together, the longer his answers grew, until by the 3rd week he was telling her, unprompted, about the winter he had nearly lost 3 fingers to frostbite trapping beaver on the North Fork, and about the elk he had once watched swim a flooded river with a broken foreleg rather than be left behind by its herd. "You care for these animals as if they were your own kin," she observed one afternoon, as they sat resting on a sun-warmed boulder above a meadow where a doe grazed with her fawn, unbothered by their quiet presence. Owen was silent long enough that Mabel thought perhaps she had overstepped, but then he spoke, his eyes on the doe rather than on her. "I had a wife once, Sarah." The name came out carefully, as though it still cost him something to say it aloud. "We came out from Ohio together back in '63, meaning to homestead down in the valley. She took a fever the second winter. There wasn't a doctor closer than 3 days' ride, and by the time I got one, it was too late." He was quiet a moment. "I buried her under a cottonwood by the creek, and I couldn't stay in that cabin another night. Came up into these mountains and never rightly came back down, not all the way. The animals up here, they don't ask you to explain yourself. They don't look at you with pity. A man can grieve up here without an audience." Mabel felt something in her chest tighten painfully, some sympathy so sharp it was nearly physical. "I am so sorry, Owen. I did not mean to pry into a wound." "You didn't pry. You asked and I answered because I wanted to." He glanced at her then, and there was something almost startled in his expression, as though he had surprised himself. "I haven't told that story to another living soul in 11 years, Miss Graves. Not to Mrs. Hutchins, not to the men in town. Don't rightly know why I'm telling it to you now, except that you listen like it matters." "It does matter," Mabel said softly. "You matter, Owen. I hope you know that, even if you have spent 11 years up this mountain trying to convince yourself otherwise." He did not answer that, but something eased in the set of his jaw, and when he rose to help her back onto her pony, his hand lingered a moment longer than necessary at her waist, and neither of them commented on it, though both of them, Mabel was fairly certain, noticed. It was in the 5th week of her stay that the mountain showed Mabel a different side of its character, one that reminded her, and reminded Owen as well, exactly how fragile a person's life could be against the indifference of stone and weather. They had climbed higher than usual that day, seeking a reported nesting site for a pair of peregrine falcons near the base of Silvertip Peak's most formidable cliff face, a wall of pale granite that Owen said few men in the territory had ever successfully climbed. Mabel had insisted on scrambling partway up a lower ledge to get a clearer angle for her field glasses, against Owen's initial objection, and it was there, on a narrow shelf of rock no wider than a farmhouse porch step, that the ground gave way beneath her boot. She did not even have time to cry out properly before she was falling, her satchel tearing from her shoulder, her hand scraping uselessly at crumbling rock, and then a hand closed around her wrist with a grip like an iron shackle, and arrested her fall so suddenly that her shoulder screamed with the strain of it. Owen had thrown himself flat against the ledge above, one arm extended over the drop, his whole considerable strength holding her weight as she dangled above what was easily a 60-foot fall onto broken talus. "I've got you," he said, his voice tight but steady, no trace of panic in it, only fierce concentration. "Don't look down. Look at me. Mabel, look at me." She looked up into his pale gray eyes, wide with a fear she suspected he rarely allowed himself, and found in them an anchor more solid than any rock. "I'm going to pull you up. It's going to hurt your arm some, but I need you to help me. Get your other hand up here when I say." "I trust you," she said, and meant it with her whole being. He pulled her up with a single powerful heave of muscle that she felt in the strain of his shoulder against her side as she scrambled the last distance onto the ledge, and then they were both lying flat against the stone, breathing hard, her hand still locked in his, and for a long moment neither of them moved to let go. "You could have died," Owen said finally, and his voice cracked slightly on the word died in a way that told Mabel exactly how much the moment had frightened him. "You did not let me," she said. "I won't ever let you," he said, and then seemed to hear the weight of his own words and looked away from her, out over the valley, his jaw working. "I mean to say I'll always keep you safe up here. That's my job, guiding you." "Owen." She sat up slowly, her shoulder aching, and reached out to touch his arm, feeling the tension in the muscle beneath her fingers. "You may call it your job if that is easier for you to say aloud, but I do not think that is only what it is." He turned to look at her then, and the careful distance he had maintained for 5 weeks seemed, for just a moment, to crack entirely open, and Mabel saw in his face something raw and unguarded and hungry, the face of a man who had spent 11 years alone on a mountain convincing himself he did not need another living soul, confronted suddenly with proof that he had been wrong. "No," he admitted quietly. "It isn't only that." Neither of them moved to close the distance between them that day, both too shaken by the near fall and too uncertain of what such a confession might mean. But something had shifted between them on that narrow ledge above the tailless slope, and both of them knew it, and both of them carried it back down the mountain in a silence that felt, for the first time, entirely comfortable. That night, Owen did not simply see her to the edge of town and turn back for the mountain as had become his habit. Instead, he accepted Mrs. Hutchins's offer of supper, sitting at the long table in the inn's dining room among a handful of other guests, looking, Mabel thought, entirely out of his element, and yet unwilling to leave. It was over that meal that Mabel first became aware of the town's opinion regarding her expeditions, delivered by a mining engineer named Cyrus Prout, who had taken a room at the inn while surveying claims up the valley, and who apparently considered himself entitled to an opinion on matters that did not concern him. "A woman climbing rock with a mountain man for 5 weeks running," Prout said, not quite under his breath, to another boarder. "Boston must breed them peculiar." Mabel felt her spine stiffen, but it was Owen who spoke first, his voice quiet but carrying an edge of iron that silenced the table. "Miss Graves is a scientist conducting a survey for the Boston Ornithological Society, Mr. Prout. She has more courage climbing that mountain than most men I've guided up it, yourself included, should you ever be tempted to try." Prout reddened and returned his attention to his plate, and Mrs. Hutchins hid a smile behind her serving spoon, but Mabel caught Owen's eye across the table and saw in it a fierce, unspoken loyalty that warmed her more than any words could have. "You did not need to defend me," she said quietly, once the other boarders had drifted off and only the two of them remained at the table. "I know I didn't need to," Owen said. "I wanted to. There's a difference, Mabel." It was the first time he had used her given name without her invitation, and the sound of it in his low voice sent a small shiver through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You may call me that always if you like," she said. "Mabel. I find I much prefer it to Miss Graves, from you at least." "Then Mabel it is," he said, and the smile that crossed his face, rare and unguarded, was, she thought, the single most beautiful thing she had yet observed in the entire Colorado territory, birds included. Word of Mabel's work reached her Boston sponsors by letter that arrived in Elk Fork some 2 weeks later, carried up from the railroad depot by the weekly mail rider, and it was not the encouragement she had hoped for. The Society's secretary, a Dr. Aldous Finch who had signed her original commission with evident reluctance, wrote in a hand so cramped with disapproval that Mabel could almost hear his voice reading it aloud. "Miss Graves," the letter read, "it has come to the Society's attention through correspondence with a Mr. Prout, engineer, presently surveying in your vicinity, that you have spent the whole of your commission thus far in the sole company of an unmarried frontiersman, without chaperone, engaged in activities that a lady of your station ought to consider carefully before continuing. The Society cannot in good conscience continue to fund or sanction an expedition conducted under such circumstances, regardless of its scientific merit. You are instructed to return to Boston upon receipt of this letter, your commission rescinded, unless you can provide immediate and satisfactory assurance that your conduct has been, and shall remain, entirely proper." Mabel read the letter twice through in the privacy of her small room at the inn, and felt something cold and furious settle in her chest, a feeling she recognized from every moment in her life when a man had attempted to define the boundaries of what she was permitted to want. She found Owen the next morning at the livery, saddling the horses for their day's climb, and handed him the letter without preamble, watching his face as he read it, slower than she had, his lips moving faintly over the unfamiliar cadence of formal Boston prose. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to her, his expression unreadable. "They mean to take your work from you," he said. "Because of me. They mean to take my work from me because I am a woman who dared to spend her days doing something other than what men found convenient," Mabel said sharply. "You are merely the excuse they have seized upon, Owen. Do not mistake yourself for the cause. If I hadn't guided you, then I should have fallen off that mountain in my second week alone with no one to catch my wrist," Mabel said, and softened at the pain that flickered across his face at the reminder. "Owen, look at me. I do not regret a single day I have spent on this mountain with you. Not one. If the society wishes to punish me for having found a guide who is also, as it happens, the finest and most honorable man I have ever known, then let them. I will simply find another way to publish what I have learned. I did not come 2,000 miles to be turned back by a letter. What will you do? I will finish my survey. I have 7 weeks left before the season turns and the high nests empty. I intend to use every one of them." She looked up at him, and something more vulnerable crept into her voice than she had intended to allow. "Unless you no longer wish to guide me, given what it has cost you in the town's opinion." Owen set down the saddle strap he had been buckling and crossed the small distance between them in 2 long strides, and for a moment Mabel thought he might simply speak, might offer some quiet reassurance in his low, careful voice. Instead, he reached up and cupped her face in one broad, calloused hand, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the raw strength she had felt in that same hand the day it caught her falling body from the cliff. "I have spent 11 years on that mountain, Mabel, telling myself I didn't need another soul in this world. You have spent 5 weeks proving me a liar every single day. I am not letting a letter from Boston, or the opinion of every fool in Elk Fork, take you off this mountain before I have had the chance to tell you plainly what I feel." His voice roughened. "I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the day you looked at that eagle like her life mattered more than your own comfort. I did not think I had any love left in me to give. You have shown me I was wrong about that too." Mabel felt tears rise, unbidden and entirely unscientific, and did not try to stop them. "Owen Mercer, I have fallen in love with you somewhere on the side of this mountain, and I could not tell you the precise day it happened, only that it is entirely, hopelessly true." He kissed her then, in the dim gray light of the livery stable with the horses shifting quietly in their stalls around them. A kiss that began carefully, as though he feared she might yet prove too fragile a thing for a man of his strength, and deepened when she rose onto her toes and wound her arms around his neck to prove to him she was not fragile at all. When at last they drew apart, both a little breathless, Owen rested his forehead against hers and let out a long, unsteady breath. "I don't know how to court a woman properly," he admitted. "Haven't tried in 12 years. Might be I've forgotten how. You have been courting me for 5 weeks, Owen. Every time you told me the name of a flower or caught my wrist above a 60-foot drop. I do not think you have forgotten anything at all." They rode up the mountain together that morning with a new lightness between them, though the work of the survey continued in earnest, and Mabel filled page after page with observations that she was determined would stand as the finest record any ornithologist, male or female, had yet produced of the high alpine bird populations of the Colorado Rockies. But something had changed in the texture of their days. Owen's hand found hers more often on difficult stretches of trail. His gaze lingered on her a beat longer than pure guiding required. And in the evenings, before he turned back toward his cabin higher on the mountain, he had taken to walking her the full distance to the inn's door rather than parting at the edge of town, as though he could not bear to relinquish her company a moment sooner than necessary. It was on one such evening, some 10 days after the letter from Boston, that they discovered the ptarmigan chicks, an event that Mabel would later record in her field notebook with unusual warmth for what was meant to be a strictly scientific document. They had climbed to a high saddle between two peaks where Owen had shown her, weeks before, the camouflaged forms of nesting ptarmigan among the scree. And this evening, arriving at dusk to check the nest before the light failed entirely, they found the eggs hatched, 6 small chicks huddled beneath their mother's wing, already patterned in the mottled brown and white that would let them vanish against the rock the instant danger threatened. Mabel sank down onto a boulder a cautious distance away, scarcely breathing, and watched through her field glasses as the mother ptarmigan called softly to her brood, coaxing them from beneath her feathers to test their first unsteady steps among the stones. "They will not survive the winter, most of them," she murmured, though there was no sorrow in her voice, only the plain acceptance of a woman who had spent enough time in wild places to understand their laws. "But some will. And those that do will nest here again next spring and the spring after. That's the way of everything up here," Owen said, settling beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. "Nothing lasts because it's easy. It lasts because it's stubborn enough to keep coming back." Mabel turned to look at him, struck by the unintended aptness of his words to more than the ptarmigan. "Is that how you have survived, Owen? Stubbornness?" "Some. And this mountain teaching me patience I never had as a young man." He was quiet a moment, watching the chicks pick their way across the scree in the fading light. "And now I don't rightly know what to call what you've taught me yet, Mabel. Might take me the rest of my life to find the word for it." "We have the rest of your life to search for it together, if you are willing," she said softly, and he turned to her with an expression so full of quiet wonder that she thought her heart might break open entirely from the tenderness of it. They did not return to Elk Fork that night, choosing instead, with a caution that spoke to Owen's respect for her rather than any diminishment of his desire, to make separate camps a short distance apart beneath the stars, close enough to talk long into the night, far enough that no one could ever question her honor, though both of them understood by then that whatever question the town or the Boston society might raise, their hearts had already answered it beyond any doubt. The trouble, when it came, did not come from Boston or from the disapproving Mr. Prout, but from the mountain itself, in the oldest and most honest way that mountains ever announce their power over the small, warm lives that dare to climb them. It was the second week of September, with the survey nearly complete, and only the highest and most remote of the Golden Eagle territories left to document, when the sky over Silvertip Peak began to change in a way that made Owen's expression, usually so calm, tighten with a wariness Mabel had not seen in him before. "We need to get off this ridge," he said, scanning the western horizon where a wall of iron-gray cloud had risen with astonishing speed over the far peaks, swallowing the afternoon sun. "That's an early storm coming, and a bad one. Mountain doesn't usually turn like this before October, but she doesn't always keep to her own calendar." They had climbed higher than usual that day, following reports of an eagle's territory near the very crown of Silvertip Peak, and the descent to lower ground and the shelter of the timberline was a full 3 hours away, even at a hard pace. Within the hour, the first snow began to fall, fine and stinging, driven nearly sideways by a wind that had not existed an hour before, and within 2 hours the world had reduced itself to a howling white blindness in which Mabel could barely see Owen's broad shoulders 3 feet ahead of her own horse. "Owen," she called, her voice tearing away in the wind. "Where are we going?" "There's a lined shack," he shouted back, barely audible. "Old Trapper's cabin, mile ahead, maybe less. Stay close to me, Mabel. Don't let more than an arm's length come between us." The mile took them nearly an hour in the deepening drifts and failing light, Owen breaking trail on foot for both horses through snow that had already reached his knees, his broad back bent against the wind with a determination that never once faltered, though Mabel could see, even through the swirling white, the exhaustion beginning to show in the set of his shoulders. When the dark shape of the lined shack finally emerged from the storm, little more than a leaning structure of rough logs with a sagging sod roof, Mabel could have wept with relief. Owen got the horses into a lean-to attached to the shack's north wall, packed with enough old hay to see them through the night, before half-carrying Mabel, her legs stiff with cold, through the low door into the single room within. A stone hearth stood cold and dark in one corner, and Owen worked with swift, practiced efficiency to get a fire going from the dry kindling stacked beside it, evidently left by some previous traveler with the same foresight the mountain demanded of anyone who meant to survive it. "This shack saved my life twice before," he said, coaxing the small flame into a proper blaze. "Trapper built it 30 years back. Been kept stocked ever since by whoever passes through. An old law of the mountains nobody ever had to write down." Mabel sank onto the single narrow cot along the far wall, her whole body shaking with cold and the aftermath of fear, and Owen came to kneel before her, chafing her frozen hands between his own broad palms with a gentleness that belied their strength. "You're safe," he said quietly, his pale eyes intent on her face in the firelight. "I've got you, Mabel. Whatever this storm does outside, you're safe in here with me." "I know," she said, and found, remarkably, that she meant it entirely, that even trapped in a leaning trapper's shack in the middle of an early blizzard on the crown of a Colorado mountain, she felt safer than she had ever felt in any drawing room in Boston. The storm raged for 2 full days, burying the little shack under drifts that reached the window ledge. And in that time Mabel and Owen talked as they had never talked before, huddled close beside the small fire, sharing the single wool blanket Owen kept rolled behind his saddle, their voices low against the howl of wind outside. He told her of his childhood in Ohio, of a father who had beaten him for softness, and a mother who had died before he was old enough to properly remember her face. She told him of a father who had loved birds more than he had loved his own daughter's company, and of a mother who had thought Mabel's fascination with wild things unbecoming in a young lady, a disapproval that had followed Mabel, in one form or another, her entire life until the day she boarded the westbound train. "You are the first person who has ever simply let me be exactly what I am," Mabel told him on the second night, her head resting against his broad chest, his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders as the fire burned low. "Not a curiosity, not a scandal, simply myself. You're the first person who ever made me want to be more than a man alone on a mountain," Owen answered, his voice a low rumble beneath her ear. "I thought I'd buried that part of myself with Sarah 11 years back. I didn't think there was room in me for it to grow again. Turns out the mountain kept it safe for me, same as she keeps everything else safe, until the right person came along to find it." "Then I am glad," Mabel whispered, "that I came looking." They did not consummate that first true declaration of love within the leaning walls of the lined shack, both of them holding to an old-fashioned propriety that neither entirely questioned. Owen too much a gentleman despite his rough mountain bearing, Mabel too mindful of what her future husband, should he prove to be that, deserved by way of a proper wedding first. But they slept that second night with her held securely against his chest, his heartbeat steady and sure beneath her ear, and Mabel thought she had never in her life felt so entirely, unshakably certain of anything as she was certain, in that moment, of her love for Owen Mercer. The storm broke on the third morning, the sky scouring itself to a hard, brilliant blue, and Owen dug the horses free of the drifted linta with a shovel he found hanging inside the shack's door, working until sweat stood on his brow despite the bitter cold, his muscles straining beneath his shirt in a way Mabel found she could not stop watching even in the midst of their ordeal. The ride back down to Elk Fork took the better part of the day, the trail thick with new snow, and by the time they came within sight of the town's scattered lights in the blue dusk, both of them were nearly asleep in their saddles from exhaustion. But Mrs. Hutchins was waiting at the door of the inn with a lantern held high, and an expression of such profound relief that Mabel understood, for the first time, exactly how frightened the town had been on their behalf during those 2 lost days. "We thought the storm might have taken you both," Mrs. Hutchins said, ushering them inside toward the fire with brisk, motherly efficiency. There's soup on, and I'll not hear a word of protest, Miss Graves. You look half frozen through." It was over that soup, with color slowly returning to both their faces, that Mrs. Hutchins mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a second letter had arrived from Boston during the storm, along with an unexpected visitor who had taken a room at the inn only that morning and had been asking, quite insistently, after Miss Mabel Graves. The visitor proved to be Dr. Aldous Finch himself, the very secretary of the Boston Ornithological Society, whose disapproving letter had so nearly ended Mabel's commission weeks before. A thin, precise man of perhaps 50 years who had, it emerged, taken the long and uncomfortable journey west specifically to assess in person whether the Society's investment in Mabel's survey had been entirely wasted on impropriety, as Mr. Prout's continued letters had suggested. He received Mabel the following morning in the inn's small parlor with a stiffness that suggested he had rehearsed his disapproval the entire journey, and Mabel, though exhausted from the ordeal of the storm and aching in every limb, faced him with her chin lifted and her field notebooks, 6 of them now, filled with meticulous drawings and careful measurements, stacked on the table between them. "Dr. Finch," she said, before he could begin whatever prepared speech he carried, "I believe you will find, upon examination of these notebooks, that I have documented 17 distinct nesting sites across 4 species previously unrecorded at this elevation in any published survey, including detailed observations of golden eagle territorial behavior that I believe exceed anything currently held by the Society's library. I have done this work in 4 months, under conditions no male surveyor sent by your society has ever been asked to endure, and I have done it honorably, in the company of a guide whose conduct toward me has been, at every moment, that of a perfect gentleman." Dr. Finch, to his credit, did examine the notebooks, turning the pages with increasing care as the morning wore on, his initial stiffness giving way, page by page, to something closer to genuine scientific interest, until at last he looked up at Mabel with an expression considerably more subdued than the one he had entered with. "This is remarkable work, Miss Graves," he admitted, somewhat grudgingly. "The Society's cartographer will want copies of these coordinates." I confess I did not expect he stopped, seeming to consider his words. I did not expect this quality of observation, regardless of the circumstances of its production. Because I am a woman. Because the Society has, historically, underestimated what a determined mind is capable of, regardless of the body that carries it, Dr. Finch said, with a small, unexpected flicker of something almost like respect. "I withdraw the Society's objection to your continued field work, Miss Graves, and I shall recommend to the board that your commission be not only restored but extended, with full credit given in publication. As for the matter of your guide," he glanced toward the parlor window, through which Owen could be seen crossing the street toward the livery, his tall frame unmistakable even at a distance. "I confess I came west prepared to find some scoundrel taking advantage of a naive young woman's isolation. I find instead, from everything Mrs. Hutchins has told me this morning, a man the entire town credits with saving your life not once but twice. I am not so old and stiff a man, Miss Graves, that I cannot recognize when I have been mistaken." Mabel felt a wave of relief and vindication, so profound that her eyes stung with unexpected tears, but she held herself with the composure her 4 months on the mountain had taught her, and thanked Dr. Finch with a dignity that seemed to impress him further still. When she found Owen at the livery a short while later and relayed the news, his face broke into the widest smile she had yet seen from him, and he swept her up in an embrace that lifted her clean off her feet, laughing in a way that seemed to surprise even himself with its lightness. "Your work is saved," he said, setting her back down but keeping his arms around her. "Mabel, that's wonderful. That's truly wonderful." "Our work," she corrected gently. "I could not have documented a single nest without you, Owen. This survey belongs to both of us, whatever the Society chooses to print on its title page." He grew quiet then, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, and reached into the pocket of his buckskin coat, producing a small object that he had evidently carried there for some time, waiting for the right moment. "I'm not a man who has much to offer a woman like you," he said, his voice rough with a nervousness that seemed entirely foreign to his usual steady calm. "I've got a cabin and a mountain and more knowledge of birds and beasts than most men care to have. I don't have money or a fine house or anything a Boston man could offer you. But I have loved you, Mabel Graves, every single day since that eagle's nest, and I don't believe I will ever love anyone the way I love you, not if I live 100 years on this mountain." He opened his hand to reveal a ring, simply made, a band of gold worked with a small, careful engraving of a bird in flight, clearly the work of some frontier silversmith rather than a fashionable Boston jeweler, and Mabel understood with a jolt that he must have ridden into the nearest larger town at some point during their acquaintance, perhaps on one of his monthly supply trips, specifically to commission it. "I had this made after the day on the ledge," he admitted, seeing her expression. "Told myself I was foolish to hope that a woman like you would never want to stay in a place like this with a man like me, but I couldn't stop myself from having it made just in case." "Owen Mercer," Mabel said, her voice thick with tears she no longer tried to hide, "ask me properly and see what answer you receive." He laughed, a low, joyful sound, and sank onto one knee right there in the dust of the livery yard, holding the ring up to her with both his broad, calloused hands as though it were the most precious thing he had ever offered anyone, which, Mabel understood, it was. "Mabel Graves, will you marry me? Will you stay on this mountain and let me spend the rest of my life showing you every hidden thing she keeps and building a home with you and loving you every single day for the rest of both our lives?" "Yes," Mabel said before he had even finished the question, sinking down to kneel with him in the dust, uncaring of her skirts, uncaring of anything except the man in front of her. "Yes, Owen, 1,000 times yes." They were married 3 weeks later, in the small log church at the edge of Elk Fork, on a crisp October morning with the aspens along the creek turned to brilliant gold and the first true snow of winter dusting the highest peaks in white. Mrs. Hutchins wept openly through the entire ceremony and insisted on organizing the wedding breakfast herself, refusing all offers of payment, declaring that she had never in her life witnessed a courtship so thoroughly earned by hardship and honesty as theirs. Dr. Finch, who had delayed his return east specifically to witness the event, stood as an unlikely witness alongside the groom, having grown, over the intervening weeks, into something approaching genuine friendship with the mountain man whose competence he had once so thoroughly underestimated. Even Mr. Prude attended, somewhat sheepishly, and offered a stiff but sincere congratulation that Mabel accepted with more grace than his earlier gossip had strictly deserved. Mabel wore a simple dress of pale blue wool, made over from her traveling clothes by Mrs. Hutchins's capable hands, with a spray of late wildflowers gathered by Owen himself from a meadow he alone knew, high on the mountain's western shoulder, that bloomed later than any other in the territory, sheltered as it was from the first frosts by a fold of rock that trapped the warmth of the sun. Owen stood at the front of the small church in a new coat purchased for the occasion, his long hair combed and tied back, looking, Mabel thought, both entirely unlike himself and entirely, wonderfully himself all at once, his pale gray eyes fixed on her from the moment she appeared in the church door with an expression of such open, unguarded love that she scarcely heard the minister's words over the pounding of her own heart. "I, Owen Mercer, take thee, Mabel Graves," he said, his voice steady and sure despite the roughness of long disuse in matters of formal speech, "to have and to hold in the mountains and in the valleys, in the storms and in the fair weather, for as long as we both shall live. And I promise you before God and this whole town that I will show you every hidden thing this mountain keeps, for the rest of our days, and love you more with each one that passes." Mabel, when her turn came, found her voice thick with emotion but entirely certain. "I, Mabel Graves, take thee, Owen Mercer, to have and to hold, to study every wild thing this world offers alongside you, to make my home on your mountain and call it my own, for as long as we both shall live. And I promise you that I will love you as fiercely and as faithfully as any eagle loves her mate, for every season we are given." They settled into Owen's cabin on the mountain's lower slope, a sturdy log structure he had built himself over the years, which Mabel, with characteristic energy, immediately set about expanding and improving, adding a proper window with real glass carried up carefully from the mercantile, a small stone chimney to replace the old smoky hearth, and most importantly to her, a dedicated corner for her writing desk and specimen cases, where she continued her correspondence with the Boston Ornithological Society and began the work of preparing her survey for formal publication. The finished volume, published the following spring under the title A Survey of the Alpine Avifauna of the Colorado Rocky Mountains, by Mabel Graves Mercer, with an acknowledgement of invaluable field assistance from Owen Mercer, became, over the following years, a modest but respected addition to the scientific literature of the region, cited by naturalists who followed in her footsteps, and it opened, as she had hoped it might, a narrow but permanent door for other women who wished to follow her example into fields long closed to them. Dr. Finch, true to his word, saw to its printing with unusual personal attention, and the two maintained a warm correspondence for years afterward, Dr. Finch occasionally sending seed catalogs and scientific journals up the long mountain trail with the same male writer who had once carried his disapproving letter. Their life together on the mountain was not without its ordinary hardships, the kind that any homestead in that high, wild country would know. A hard winter in their second year together that tested even Owen's considerable skill at keeping a household fed and warm. A summer of drought that thinned the meadow grass and worried them both about the coming winter's hay. The ordinary griefs of losing livestock to wolves, and once, very nearly losing their own cabin to a lightning-sparked fire that Owen fought back with a courage and quick thinking that left Mabel more in awe of him than ever. But through each hardship they faced the mountain together, exactly as they had faced that first great storm in the Leaning Line shack, and each trial seemed only to deepen the roots of a love that had, after all, been built from its very beginning on honesty, respect, and a shared wonder at the wild world around them. In their third year of marriage, Mabel gave birth to their first child, a son, born in the depths of a February so cold that Owen had to break ice from the creek with an axe each morning to fetch water, delivered with the help of Mrs. Hutchins, who had ridden up the mountain trail herself despite the season, rather than trust the birth to anyone less capable. They named him Thomas, after Owen's own long-dead father, in a gesture of quiet forgiveness that Mabel understood cost her husband more than he ever fully admitted aloud, though she saw it in the softness of his face each time he held the boy, as though he were determined to give his own son every gentleness his father had withheld from him. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Sarah, after the wife Owen had lost so many years before, a choice Mabel herself suggested, understanding without needing to be told that some love does not require jealousy to be honored, that the woman who had shared Owen's youth deserved to be remembered with tenderness rather than erased by the woman who now shared his life. And Owen wept, quietly and without shame, the first time he heard his infant daughter's name spoken aloud. Grateful beyond words for a wife generous enough to make room in their family for the ghosts that had shaped him. Thomas grew up, as might be expected of a child raised on that mountain by such parents, with an unusual fascination for the wild creatures around him, following his father on shorter and shorter excursions from the age of 4, learning to identify bird calls from his mother before he had properly learned his letters. And by the time he was 10 years old, he could lead a pony up the lower trails, with nearly the same quiet competence his father had shown Mabel on that very first climb to Cataract Creek. Sarah, for her part, inherited her mother's careful, patient eye for detail, and spent hours as a small child sitting beside Mabel at the writing desk, helping with observations in a careful, laborious child's hand that Mabel preserved in a special notebook long after Sarah had grown skilled enough to write legibly on her own. The golden eagles at Cataract Creek continued to nest in their hidden gorge for many years afterward, and it became a tradition in the Mercer family, each spring, to make the climb together as a family to observe the new eaglets, Owen carrying Sarah on his broad shoulders in her early years, while Thomas walked proudly at his father's side, Mabel bringing up the rear with her ever-present field glasses and notebook, recording, year after year, the continuation of a life cycle that had first brought her and Owen together on that narrow granite ledge above the roaring creek. The town of Elk Fork itself grew slowly over the years that followed, as mining interests expanded and the railroad extended a spur line closer to the valley, and Mabel found herself, in time, an unlikely but respected figure in the community, consulted by the growing number of naturalists and even a few tourists who came west specifically hoping to see the wild birds she had documented in her published survey. She established, with Owen's full support and considerable practical help in clearing and marking trails, a small but genuine sanctuary along the lower slopes of Silvertip Peak, protecting several of the more accessible nesting sites from the disturbance of casual hunters and curious visitors, an effort that Dr. Finch, in his continued correspondence, praised as among the earliest such conservation efforts undertaken west of the Mississippi. Mrs. Hutchins lived long enough to see both Mercer children grown into young adults, and remained, until her own death in Mabel's 38th year, a beloved presence in the family's life, the closest thing to a grandmother either Thomas or Sarah had ever known, and it was at her funeral, held in the same small log church where Mabel and Owen had married nearly 2 decades before, that Mabel found herself reflecting on the full arc of the life she had built. A life that had begun with a single letter from a disapproving scientific society, and a determined young woman's refusal to accept that her ambitions and her heart could not both be satisfied in the same wild country. Owen, now silvered lightly at the temples though no less broad through the shoulders than the day Mabel had first seen him walk into Elk Fork leading his pack mule, remained, throughout all the years of their marriage, exactly the man she had first glimpsed catching her wrist above a 60-foot drop. Steady, fiercely protective, endlessly patient with the wild things and wild people alike who came under his care, and possessed of a quiet tenderness toward his wife that had only deepened with each passing season. He never did learn to speak with the easy fluency of a Boston gentleman, and Mabel would not have wanted him to. His silences had always said as much as his words, and after 20 years of marriage she had learned to read every one of them, the comfortable silence of a shared evening by the fire, the watchful silence of a man scanning a mountain slope for danger to his family, the tender silence, still present even after 2 decades, of a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune in having been found, on that particular spring morning so many years before, by a woman who had crossed an entire continent looking for wild birds and found, instead, everything the mountain had been keeping hidden for him, waiting all along for her arrival. On the 20th anniversary of their wedding, Owen took Mabel back up to the ledge above Cataract Creek, now an old and familiar path for both of them, worn smooth by 2 decades of family excursions, and they sat together on the same granite outcropping where he had once caught her falling body and confessed, for the first time, that his feelings for her ran deeper than mere guidance, watching a new generation of golden eagles wheel above the gorge in the clear autumn light. "Do you ever regret it?" Owen asked her, as he had asked once or twice before over the years, though never, Mabel thought, entirely free of some old, private fear that she might one day answer differently than she always had. "Staying up here, instead of going back to Boston, to the kind of life you might have had. Mabel took his weathered hand in both of hers, tracing the familiar calluses that 2 decades of mountain life had carved into his palm, and looked out over the valley they had made their home. The cabin now expanded twice over, the sanctuary trails winding visible through the aspens below. The whole wide, wild country that had once seemed to her merely a subject for scientific study, and had become, instead, the entire geography of her heart. "I came west to study wild birds, Owen," she said softly, "and I found a man who showed me every nest this mountain kept hidden, and in doing so showed me my own heart, hidden as thoroughly as any eagle's nest on the highest, most inaccessible ledge. I have never once regretted a single day of finding it. Not one. I would cross that whole continent again 1,000 times over if it meant arriving back here, to this exact life, with you." Owen drew her close against his broad chest, exactly as he had that first night in the leaning line shack, and pressed a kiss to her hair. And above them, unbothered by the small, quiet happiness of the two humans watching from the ledge below, the golden eagles continued their ancient, wheeling flight against the vast blue sky, keeping, as they always had and always would, their high and hidden place upon the mountain that had brought two lonely hearts together and made of them, at last, a single steady home.